Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me? Welcome, welcome. We're about to get started, so thank you so much for being here. Can everybody hear me? Yes. Thanks. Talking about the Constitution back there, I know it, so they're very busy with that. I want to welcome you to the law school, and thank you for joining the Center for Constitutional Design in this very important signature yearly lecture on the the yearly event celebrating the signing of the U.S. Constitution on September 17, 1787. So we're a little early for that, but it's coming up soon, and you can be sure to celebrate that day. I'm Stephanie Lindquist. I'm the Executive Director for the Center for Constitutional Design, which was established in 2021 to advance conversations about constitutional reform, constitutional interpretation, and the advancement of constitutional democracy. We have a program series planned for you and for the law school and the community this semester, and the events are listed in the bookmark that's on your table. So it also provides some information about tonight's event, but also on the back you'll see there are some programming listed there, and I hope you will join us for all of those programs. They're open to the community, to the law school, and to the university. Tonight's lecture is our kickoff event for this academic year. And I could not think of a better speaker to deliver this year's Constitution Day address. I had the good fortune of meeting Senator Feingold at Columbia University in February. And the conversations we had there very much stimulated thinking about constitutional reform. I had the good fortune of seeing his book. And so he was kind enough to agree to deliver this year's lecture, and we thank you so much, Senator Feingold, for being here. Such a privilege to have you with us in Phoenix. For most of you, Senator Feingold needs no introduction, but allow me just to hit the high points of his incredible career. He currently serves as the president of the American Constitution Society. I know there is the president of the ASU chapter of the Constitution Society and a number of the Constitution Society members, student members here tonight. He served as U.S. Senator for Wisconsin from 1993 to 2011 and state senator in the Wisconsin legislature from 1983 to 1993. He's been a senator for quite some time, senator in both places. He also served between 2013 and 2015 as the U.S. Special Envoy to the Great Lakes region of Africa and to the Democratic Republic of the Congo. While he was in the Senate, he was the recipient of the JFK Profile and Courage Award for his bipartisanship and willingness to reach across the aisle to enact significant legislation. And as you know, he co-sponsored with our very own Senator McCain, the McCain-Feingold Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, one of the first truly bipartisan campaign reform acts that had been enacted for decades, really, in the United States Congress. Tonight he is delivering a lecture to us entitled Amending the Constitution, Twin Jeopardies. And in part this emerges, and I don't want to steal your thunder, Senator, but he told me this evening that this lecture and the idea for the book that he has written, which is called The Constitution in Jeopardy, and I recommend it to everyone, is from a course he taught at Stanford on Article 5, a really significantly neglected part of the Constitution, I think, for scholars, much like the Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which we're now rediscovering, as you well know. So the lecture this evening is based upon that course and upon the book which he co-authored with Peter Prindiville, who was one of his students at Stanford. So, Senator Feingold, we are so pleased that you are here. I'm going to turn the podium over to you. And then after the lecture, we will take questions from the audience. We have a microphone here, but I'm sorry, if you have a question, please do come up to the microphone, and we'll move this aside, and the Senator and I will sit here and have a conversation and hear from you. So thank you all of you for being here. Senator?
Well, it's an honor to give this first Constitution Day address, and I want to especially thank Stephanie Lindquist for suggesting that I come out here. I remember we met, you just walked up to me and said, "You scared me," because I had given this talk about this topic. And then we proceeded to talk about the importance of it and the possibility of coming out here. But it was at this conference at Columbia University where they brought together, I think for one of the first times, a group of scholars and others who were really wondering about constitutional change. What can be done, what should be done to change the United States Constitution, if at all. And I was one of the speakers, and it led to this opportunity to come to this great city and this great law school. I'm especially pleased to be here at the ASU Law School. I thank the Dean, Stacy Leeds, who obviously has had such a distinguished career, including getting a degree at the University of Wisconsin, which we always feel good about. I am the president of the National American Constitution Society, and you have some great students here who are members and leaders of it. Charlie Miller, the president, and Tuba Ahmed made sure that I didn't get lost today. I thank you for that very much. And we do consider this ACS chapter, we have upwards of 200, one of the best in the country on a consistent basis. So this is, of course, the American Constitution Society, which, no, it is not the opposite of the Federalist Society, but we sure don't agree with them. Anyway, and it's meaningful to be here at the Sandra Day O'Connor Law School. She happened to be the deciding vote in a case called McConnell versus FEC, but it's better known as the case that upheld a little bill called the McCain-Feingold bill. So I'm grateful for my co-author and grateful for a great Arizonan who made the right decision there. One of the reasons she made the right decision is that she had been in the political world. She wasn't just a cloistered judge. She was somebody who understood politics and the role that corruption can play in politics. So it means a lot, and of course, John and I worked together for 8 years, became dear friends, and he had about 10 jokes. His wife used to joke about it. And one of them was, in Wisconsin, people think that Feingold's first name is McCain. That was one of his favorite jokes. Anyway, he and Cindy are dear friends, and I thought about him a lot today. As I was here in your city, I hadn't been here for quite a long time. But the work that I did with him, even though campaign finance reform is an incredibly important issue that needs a lot of attention, the main thing was that, we tried to show that when you're an elected official, you can and should work with people on the other side. That's your job, not to mess with them, not to ruin their careers. And he believed in that, and that was the most meaningful aspect of that experience. So to the topic, amending the Constitution. It's kind of an obvious topic for a Constitution Day, but as Stephanie pointed out, it is rarely considered in academia. There has been no amendment to the United States Constitution for over 50 years. Some people think that Article 5, which is the mechanism by which you can amend the Constitution, is a dead letter and is so difficult that it doesn't matter anymore. And there also is a lot of fear, as I'll be pointing out, that people might try to instead call a constitutional convention. But if you think, well, why haven't I heard of this? Don't feel bad. I was on Judiciary Committee for 16 years. I didn't have any idea about this constitutional convention thing. I didn't have any idea about it until I got booted out of the Senate and went to teach. And they go, what can you teach? Well, why don't you teach about the Senate? I said, well, I think I can probably do that. And in the course of teaching about the Senate, I started thinking a little bit about the role that members of Congress play in proposing amendments to the Constitution. And that is the only mechanism that's been used. And then I started thinking more generally about why isn't there more attention to Article 5 in academia? And I discovered that no one had ever taught a course. No constitutional professor had ever taught a course. So I invented it. And, I taught it at Yale, then I taught it at Stanford a couple times. And the purpose was simply to try to illustrate, as a constitutional law matter, the role that amending plays in our system. We were the first country not only to really have a written constitution, other than maybe Poland, but certainly the first one to have a mechanism put in the Constitution telling you exactly how and when you could amend the Constitution. And that's Article 5 of the Constitution. So, I taught this course and I was enjoying it very much, and one of my students, first year at Stanford, did a great job in the course and did well, so I hired him as my teaching assistant. So the next year he came and he was my teaching assistant, and he said to me as we were about to teach the course for a second time, he said, you need to write a book about this. And I said, well, I just took this job as head of the American Constitution Society, so this is like March 9th, 2020. You know what happened next. we taught the course on Zoom, but I said, you know, I got to do this job, so let's do it together. And so he agreed to do it. It's Peter, and he's now clerking for the 10th Circuit, and is unable to do these appearances with me. But he and I decided that, yes, we wanted to warn people about the possibility that there could be this constitutional convention called by the far right, but we wanted it to be more than that. We wanted it to be a broader book that talked about this almost dilemma that you have to make sure you don't undo the fundamentals of the Constitution, but at the same time, somehow you have to be able to change it when it's not right. And it is not a document that can, in fact, it's the hardest Constitution to change in the world. So the goal of the book and tonight's lecture is primarily awareness, so that people realize how important and dangerous and potentially promising Article 5 is for our democracy. We need a national conversation about it, not only a hidden attempt by those on the right to try to do this quietly and suddenly present us with a new Constitution that looks a lot more like the Articles of Confederation than it looks like the Constitution that we have. And so that's why it's called Twin Jeopardies. We see a jeopardy in the possibility of constitutional convention, but we also see a very serious jeopardy in the possibility that we won't be able to ever do anything because of all this partisanship and won't be able to fix anything. So let's go back to the basics of this. Article 5, it's very simple. If you want to pass a constitutional amendment, you either have to get 2/3 of both houses of the United States Congress to vote in the same language, and the president has nothing to do with this. It just goes to the states for ratification, and 3/4 of the states have to ratify it. I assume many of you, if not all of you, know that. But the second mechanism is the mechanism to call a constitutional convention. It is entirely legitimate. It is legal. It was agreed upon on, I think, the 2 days before, September 15th, maybe, 1787, was right at the end. And it says that if 2/3 of the states apply for a constitutional convention, the Congress shall call. Not if they feel like it, not let's debate it, let's think about it. They have to do it. And so it's like a mandatory mechanism. And so those are the two ways. But our history is pretty interesting in that there never has been a constitutional convention. It's come close. It's come within a couple of states on different occasions, but it's never happened. In fact, the fear that there would be a constitutional convention right away as ratification was occurring and as they were trying to persuade the states to ratify the Constitution. One of the main reasons that it was ratified was the promise made by the Federalist Paper authors, particularly James Madison, that as soon as the Congress convenes, we will pass a Bill of Rights, which were amendments. 10 amendments. We've only had 27 amendments. 10 are the Bill of Rights. And you know, these days, can you imagine people believing a politician, don't worry, as soon as it's over, we'll, we'll take care of it. Well, they did it because they knew they might lose the whole deal, that the Union might not stay together. So it was key to ratification, amending. But then amending basically kind of stopped. There were a couple of amendments. There were attempts at amendments before the Civil War to deal with the slavery problem, to the point that when you get to the end of the 19th century, a famous political scientist wrote a tome about politics that said the Constitution is done. It is not going to be amended anymore. It is basically in the form it needs to be in, and there will never be any amendments. This guy's name was Woodrow Wilson, who later was on the floor of the Senate begging people to amend the Constitution during the Progressive era because there was a spate of constitutional amendments pushed by progressives. And in fact, many of them were trying to get a constitutional convention to deal with things like directly electing senators. You know, senators don't usually vote for things that are different than the way they got elected. But these guys voted for the 17th Amendment to directly elect senators because they did not want a constitutional convention that would be open-ended and do a lot of other things they didn't want. They also used it to overturn the Supreme Court's ruling on making the income tax illegal. They did it to pass a woman's right to vote. And yes, they did it for prohibition. So those were the four big ones. And those, so that was like a whole era of amendments. And then it kind of slowed down again. And it basically has never returned to the point where we have this sort of feeling now that it's very, very difficult, almost impossible, to amend the Constitution. The closest we came was in the 60s, when Birch Bayh, a senator from Indiana who chaired the Constitution Subcommittee like I did in the Senate, he actually got an elimination of the Electoral College through the House of Representatives on an overwhelming bipartisan vote. People just thought, well, this is never going to happen again, right? Why have this in here? You're never going to have a situation where one guy gets some more votes, and you know. So, and it almost was passed the Senate, but it didn't because the Southern senators were nervous that this would create problems for their segregation agenda. But this was not partisan at all, and it was a time when there was a belief that this could happen. But let's get back to why or how it came to be that there was these two choices. Well, on the first day of the Constitutional Convention, the Virginia plan was laid down, and that was the beginning of the discussion. And it had a lot of things in there, of course, that were debated over the summer, but one of them was that there shall be the ability to amend the Constitution, and the national government will have no say in it. In other words, there was to be no congressional role. There was only to be constitutional conventions. And they sent it to something called the Committee on Detail that Hamilton got himself on. And when it came out of there, Hamilton said, no, actually, the Congress is the only one that can do it. There will be no constitutional convention. And he got everybody but one state to vote for that. And then George Mason of Virginia said, okay, then we're leaving, basically. And said, you're either going to put in, and he's an anti-federalist, you're either going to put in a provision to allow a direct constitutional convention or we won't be here. So at the last minute, they threw this thing in there, but James Madison agreed to it, but he said there seems to be a problem with quorum and form. In other words, there were absolutely no rules. There's absolutely no information in the Constitution that tells you how the heck this thing should run. It's the opposite of the one Congress does. It's very clear. And so it was, in effect, a compromise. They were desperate to get this thing done. And yes, it's a great document, but some of it shows that they were kind of desperate. And this is an example of that because in some ways, as we describe in one of our chapters, it's a sleeping giant. But again, I want to emphasize that it is, in fact, a legitimate mechanism. Our goal in writing this book was not to just tar people and saying they're doing something inappropriate. It's completely appropriate to use this mechanism. It is the law of the land. Having said that, coming up to the present, the current very well-funded, very serious, very extreme effort to call this constitutional convention by the Convention of the States Group is a sleight of hand. It's an attempt to use this mechanism in a way that is really has no justification for the approach they take. And if you don't believe me that there's a real effort going on, this isn't some conspiracy theory, this in fact is, if you read nothing else, chapter 5, called What Trump and the Tea Party Couldn't Do. And what Rick Santorum, my former colleague, we didn't always get along, but he said, we're planning on putting resources, people in place to get where the safety's off, and we have a live weapon in our hands. This is not the language used in Philadelphia. You know, comparing a mechanism for constitutional change to a grenade. Well, that's exactly what they're doing, but they're working their tails off on this. They have had practice sessions with conservative legislators from every state for over 13 years now. They had one in 2014 that didn't go that well, so they did one in 2016 in Virginia. And, you know, people made fun of them, people on the left and others said, oh, they had a guy dressed up as George Washington on a video, and kind of made fun of it, that people were dressed up in colonial stuff. And not everybody, but the truth is they got together and they had several days of debate, and they, you know, it was good faith debate. It was like very professionally done, and they had committees and they made proposals and they made amendments. And then at the end of the a few days, they had votes. They did the whole thing of how a convention would work. And the key here is that when it came time to vote, what did they do? Each state gets one vote, not all the delegates. California, Wyoming, Vermont, New York, they all get one vote. So what does this remind you of? The distortions of our current system in the Constitution of the Electoral College, the United States Senate, the filibuster, layering malapportionment on top of malapportionment, where the Constitution itself would be rewritten by a convention that would be based on an extreme minority of people in this country, and in a way that would be, in my view, very dangerous. If you don't believe me, here are some of the things that passed. The first thing was that they were going to severely limit the power of Congress to act on a number of issues. A good example would be you wouldn't be able to deal with the COVID problem. They would severely constrain the administrative agencies of the country so that the EPA could not act on climate change or clean water. They would make the income tax illegal. Now, one of my supporters at one of these events said, "Oh, that sounds like a good idea." I said, "No, that's it." She had a lot of money. But the big one, I call it the John C. Calhoun Amendment, the one they like the best, would provide that if 30 state legislatures, not the governor, not the people of the state of Arizona, but simply the legislatures, voted on a majority vote to overturn any act of Congress or any administrative law, it was gone. It's nullification. This is the big fantasy. So they just held another one of these conferences. They've just practiced again in Williamsburg a couple of weeks ago. And this time, they made it so that it would be only a majority of states could do this. And apparently, it was absolute pandemonium after they passed it. Everybody stood up and cheered. I mean, as I said, this is essentially taking us back to the Articles of Confederation. It's gutting the ability of the federal government to function. And they have a very well-oiled machine trying to do this. Now, what are among the problems with having such a convention is we simply don't know what the rules are. How do you count these applications? How do you count 34 applications? Can they be about all different topics? Some of these guys claim that there's enough applications already by counting some of the anti-slavery ones from before the Civil War. You know, Massachusetts sends a resolution in 1850 saying we should get rid of slavery, and they're counting it for this. Others want to merge balanced budget ones with term limit ones. In other words, they want to mix and match and use what I would call fuzzy math to require the Congress to call such a convention. So we call that a counting problem. Secondly, they claim, the conservatives here, and it's not all conservatives, it's just this group, Convention of the States, because many conservatives know this isn't a good idea. They claim that, no, you can limit the topics of this thing, don't worry about it. The resolutions just talk about a couple of things. Not to worry, we'll just get together and we'll stick to that. What's going to stop them? It's a convention. It's a legally called convention, and there is absolutely no authority in the Constitution saying you can limit it. Charles Black, the famous Yale law professor, said, why call it a runaway convention? There's nothing to run away from. There is no ability to limit it. And by the way, I agree with that. If 34 of the states all say, we would like to completely rewrite the Constitution, they have a right to do it. But not taking balanced budget here, gun control here, campaign finance here, and putting it together and acting like that was an invitation to undo the whole Constitution. So that's a critical issue. The third is, how are these delegates going to be chosen? One would hope they would be chosen by the people of the states, but that's not what they're doing. They're picking the leading conservative, right-wing, gerrymandered legislators in states like Arizona and Wisconsin. So certainly in Wisconsin, our legislature bears no relationship to the voting patterns of the people of the state. And yet these are the people. These are the people who would be rewriting your Constitution. And finally, as I've said, they do this idea that it should be one vote per state. And in fact, this group, the Convention of the States, purposely called themselves the Convention of the States because they want to pretend that this is a convention of the states. It is no such thing. The only thing the states do is pass through their legislature an application. And the Constitution of our country begins with the words, "We the people purposely," not "we the states." That was the Articles of Confederation. Each state had a veto. We the people. They are purposely trying to get people to think of this in this other way. Some people say, again, not to worry. Okay, so you got 34 states calling this, you got this convention. You still need 38, you still need 3/4 of the states to ratify anything. So what are you worried about? Well, 34 to 38? Doesn't sound like that much to me. And these amendments hang around forever. They don't die. They're just out there for consideration, although that's an interesting subject with regard to the ERA that we can get into later. But what you have here is the potential. This is what can happen in the next few months, in the next 2 years. And again, you might say, well, that's never going to happen. Well, there's a lot of things that I never thought would happen, like January 6th. Well, these are the same people. This is John Eastman of January 6th fame, who's the key theoretician behind this. Steve Bannon has said that this convention is his top priority. And yesterday, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Kevin McCarthy, said that he is totally on board the Convention of the States. What does that mean? That means if the Republicans keep control of the House and win the Senate, they can just do this. There are bills that have been introduced that said there's already 34 states. They can just say it's time to do it. President has nothing to do with it. There is no authority for the Supreme Court to intervene whatsoever in the Constitution. It doesn't appear that, certainly this Supreme Court, I don't know what they would think because this is a pretty frightening thing even for them. But there's no authority other than this mechanical act of creating this convention where we have absolutely no idea what the rules would be. And of course, some people on the left understandably say, wait a minute, what are you afraid of? Let's have a convention, let her rip. And a lot of good people say this. People that believe in campaign finance reform. People that weren't happy when the court and Citizens United undermined McCain-Feingold. So there's movements out there for a constitutional amendment campaign finance reform. Governor Newsom of California just passed, I think he got it done today, a constitutional convention call for gun control, to change the way in which the Second Amendment operates. It's understandable. But if this convention is called, as I suspect it will be, that's not what they're going to come up with. They're going to put Citizens United in the Constitution. They're going to take the real language of the Second Amendment that begins with a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. They're going to cut that first half off. And they're just going to make it, I mean, it's to the point where Hunter Biden today, after he's indicted, the reason he might get off is that there's probably going to be a Supreme Court ruling that the law that he was charged under was unconstitutional. So is it a really good idea to throw this idea of these liberal or progressive ideas in the context of a constitutional convention? So this is, again, my main purpose, although I am a bit of an advocate on it, is to just get people to be aware of it and to think about it as we go through this process. So that's the first Jeopardy. I hope there's time for me to still talk about the second Jeopardy, because I know Stephanie expected me to do that. And I've already alluded to it. It is so hard to fix anything in this Constitution. The last time we had a constitutional amendment, the 27th Amendment, I happen to believe that the ERA has already been ratified and it's the 28th, but let's say it's 27th. The 27th Amendment, I don't know if you guys even know what it was. It's 200 years old. It was one of the things that James Madison proposed along with the Bill of Rights. It just said that members of Congress weren't supposed to get pay raises during their term. Some kid at the University of Texas Law School wrote a paper about this, and he was flunked. They said, this is stupid. He said, oh yeah? And he started a national movement to get the thing ratified. And I voted for it as a Wisconsin state senator. And it became the 27th Amendment. That's the last thing we've had. And you know, there are issues. How about getting rid of the Electoral College? You have to do that through a constitutional amendment? Probably. How about the fact that there is no right to vote explicitly identified in the Constitution? It kind of matters in this state and Wisconsin. I like to say that the founders did a lot of good stuff, but they were really very weak on climate change. You know, most modern constitutions have provisions about the environment. So it has to be updated, and it can't be done under the current partisanship. They're just getting 2/3 from both houses is so difficult. I mean, even the pardon power. You know, this guy, some guy thinking he can pardon himself, probably should be clarified. You know, even something like that doesn't get anywhere. So how do we ever reflect this country that we are now in the 21st century, the diverse nation that we are? How do we stop a United States Supreme Court from using absurd historical examples to justify taking away New York's simple gun control laws or to do the Dobbs decision? The only way is to somehow figure out a way to change Article 5 itself. And this is the part of the analysis that we've done less of. Maybe it's the next book. But it's hard, and I'm not going to pretend to you that it's easy, but to me, it's the only way out is to amend Article 5, to change the way we amend the Constitution. And so that would involve, in part, probably making it a little bit easier, lower standard, not a majority, something stronger, to pass something through Congress. But yes, to improve the Constitutional Convention provisions, to have actual constitutional provisions that talk about how delegates are chosen, whether or not you can limit topics, and having some rules for the darn thing. Because if you don't have that, what could happen is we could just simply have a constitutional crisis coming up where they try to do this thing, this convention's called, and nobody knows where the legitimacy of it is or isn't, which of course is what Steve Bannon wants to happen. We also think that for ratification, it could be a more democratic process. Still state by state, but in this way. A majority of the states have to ratify a constitutional amendment, but by popular vote, not by the state legislature. And then a national referendum on the amendment has to pass as well. This would make it easier. Another way to solve the problem would be to do basically what we have in many states like Wisconsin, which is any constitutional amendment before it goes to the people has to pass by majority vote, but by majority vote in 2 different legislatures, and then it goes to the people for a vote. So these are just some ideas about how we might change this. And you might say, well, Russ, that sounds good, but how likely is it? Not very. I mean, I hate to say this because we're in a trap. But somehow, courageous people, like the former Congresswoman from Wyoming need to come together and say, we got to be able to do this. And we should form a bipartisan commission that would recommend to Congress a constitutional amendment that would make it possible to amend the Constitution in a reasonable way. I like to look at an example of what's going on in another part of the world to conclude in terms of this topic. So as you know, there were horrific things done in Chile under Pinochet, disappearing people, and my wife and I happened to be just before COVID. We took what we call a vacation of a lifetime down to Patagonia, which was amazing. But first we went to Santiago, and just to make the transition. And we went out for dinner. And all of a sudden, you know, I felt like I was back in Madison in 1969. Tear gas and hoses, and I mean, it was, and my wife's like, oh, this is fun. I said, let's, yeah, she's tougher than I am. But they had months and months of protests back in 2019, 2020, until the decision was made, because they still have the Pinochet-era Constitution. Let's have a constitutional convention. And they had a national referendum to elect the delegates. And what the people in that country did was really interesting. They didn't elect anybody to be a delegate who was a member of any of the political parties. They elected indigenous people, teachers, sanitation workers and others, and they worked hard for a year to come up with a proposed constitution. And then it was submitted to the voters, and it didn't pass. I mean, it lost 55-45. But it was a real process. And so now, with a conservative government, they're doing it again. There's a new convention. And some of the top American law professors, like Bruce Ackerman of Yale, who I taught with, he went down there the other day and said, they asked him to address them. And he said, well, listen, your emergency powers thing here is way too loose, et cetera. It's a real process where the people are directly involved. It will be based on a legitimate type of delegation, and then the people of the country will get to decide. So it is possible to do this. I, for one, am not one of those, although there are many good people who say constitutionalism is dead, that we shouldn't have a constitution anymore. We should have something more like what England has, which is an unwritten constitution, but Parliament still has largely the ability to change whatever it wants. I'm not part of that, but I also am not one who believes that our Constitution as it was originally written, or even as it's been amended, is adequate. Our organization, the American Constitution Society, has spoken for a couple of years about the founding failures of our Constitution. It still has a heavy racial bias that has created enormous negative consequences in almost every area of public policy, and it needs to be fixed. But the last thing I'll say is, somehow we can't fall for this trap of allowing a movement in this country that in many ways does not believe in our democracy and certainly does not believe in what this country really is in the 21st century, to let them pull this stunt and call this convention that could do great harm. So I urge you to talk to your friends and especially your legislators on this. They are more important than the congressmen on this. It's the legislators who vote whether or not to apply, and it's the legislators who would be the delegates in all likelihood, unless we can change the way it is now. So thank you. Those are the twin jeopardies. Move that away, yeah.
That's heavy.
Do this without falling over.
Okay, we're going to take questions from the audience, but I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and ask the first question, if you don't mind. And I've been interested, and thank you so much for bringing this to our attention. And by the way, you can understand why the first words I said to the senator when I saw him in Columbia was, "You've scared me," because he certainly did. In Amendment 5, or in Article 5, it says that Congress shall call the convention if the 2/3 of the states request it. What makes Congress do that? Could Congress refuse to call the convention? What enforcement mechanism is there? So that's the first part of the question. The second is, I know that Congress has tried to pass statutes that would regulate what would happen at the convention. Does Congress have the power to enact, if it could, and I don't think it will, but if it could, to regulate what happens at the convention in terms of the voting and the number of votes per state and things you mentioned?
Yeah, I'd say first of all that Congress can't refuse to do this, and who would enforce it? I think that is something that would be taken to the Supreme Court. That is so explicit that I could see the Supreme Court having authority to say, look, this is plain language. It's different than somebody going to the Supreme Court and saying, well, you have to tell us whether or not the topics can be limited. That's not addressed. But what is addressed in the amendment is that they have to do it. So I think that that the Convention of the States People and others would go to the United States Supreme Court, and I don't know what basis they would have for saying that Congress has discretion here. And that's a little bit similar to your second question. There was a great fear at times in the 1960s that a convention like this would be called with regard to the issue that really created the first modern thing on this. This was the resistance to the reapportionment cases. Baker versus Carr, and help me, what's the other one? Reynolds versus Sim. So, these were great Warren Court decisions that had especially to do with the malapportionment of the state senate. A great United States senator from Illinois, who one of the 3 buildings in Washington is named after for the Senate, Everett Dirksen, although he really helped the Civil Rights Bill, He took a very different tack on this. He led a national movement to try to override the reapportionment decisions. And he tried to do it first through getting it through Congress. And then he proceeded to try to do a constitutional convention. And they almost got one to overturn this thing, except for Dirksen suddenly died. And my state of Wisconsin actually went against doing it. So the second question, I just want to make sure I get back
Just
to
whether Congress has the power to regulate what happens.
And yes, so what happened was that in anticipation or the fear of this, people like Senator Sam Ervin, Bobby Kennedy, and others started drafting up rules that could be used. But there appears to be absolutely no authority for that. That's why we need a constitutional amendment. There's no basis for Congress to say, all right, we're going to call this, but here are the rules. Maybe somebody would argue that you can do that. But I believe they can't do that, and that the rules would be set by the convention itself.
The convention itself.
That's what Peter and I concluded.
The scary
but of
part.
course, there's no real law on it.
Yeah.
Because it's never happened.
Do you think it's, anyone? Please, if you want to ask a question. Okay, well, you don't have to, it would be nice if you came to the microphone only because, or we can hand the microphone around. Carol, well, you all just yell it out. Go ahead. Sure. Just speak loudly so everyone in the audience can hear your question.
Well, first, Senator, your work on your amendment with Senator McCain is one of the great works of campaign finance reform, and thanks for that. That being the case, you're one of the most important voices in campaign finance reform in the last century. And the fact that we can't get something as common sense and seemingly clearly settled as the ERA settled as an amendment, what kind of mechanisms do you think are the way forward for campaign finance reform, barring a constitutional amendment?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very important issue about how you would even do a constitutional amendment. I think there's several things. Keep in mind, Citizens United said that, okay, corporations are people and they should be able to be involved in campaigns, which did not overturn McCain-Feingold. It overturned the Tillman Act signed by Teddy Roosevelt. It's crazy, you know, it was literally undoing the whole campaign finance law. Justice Kennedy, who was in many ways a very good justice, but in this case a terrible justice, said, oh, of course, if you're going to do this, you can't have any coordination with the political parties. Well, it's ridiculous. They coordinate it completely. There's no real enforcement. This should be a serious federal crime. Congress could pass that. Secondly, he said, well, we do this today on this 5-4 vote. Of course, on the assumption that Congress will require the disclosure. Well, when McCain and I would get up on the floor, McConnell would get up and say, you know, John and Russ are here trying to get all this regulation of free speech. All you need is sunshine. All you need is disinfectant. All you need is disclosure. Well, sure enough, as soon as they got Citizens United, they refused to pass disclosure. So those two things can be done. Everybody thinks John and I only did campaign finance. We also wanted to change the Federal Elections Commission. The Federal Elections Commission is a joke because it's got equal numbers of Democrat and Republicans. It didn't used to work like this, but it's completely blocked by loggerheads. So we wanted an administrative agency with actual enforcement. In the House, a lot of good members of the House, like Ro Khanna, are proposing to have voluntary contributions that would be matched by a tax benefit. That's another way to get around this. They're doing it in places like Seattle. Maine has laws like this, in New York. So, but the big thing, the thing that Hillary Clinton and I ran in 2016 hoping to do was to get this overturned. And that would lead to a very long discussion about judicial reform, which I'm prepared to do. Adding seats to the Supreme Court, term limits for justices, which the American Constitution Society endorses. We've got to get that decision overturned. So those are a series of things. There's plenty of work to be done in this area. And state experimentation is always a valuable part of this. Montana's been a particular leader.
Thank you. Oh, is it fixed? Okay, great.
We're all familiar. Can you hear me? We're all familiar with issues like, ERA. You mentioned global warming, privacy, elections reform. In a world where we have more liberal amending powers, what are the lesser known issues you wish people would consider when amending the Constitution?
Well, I mentioned a couple of them. I mean, one of the jokes was that Donald Trump was a very not pleasant but constitutional law teacher. Like, all of a sudden we're talking about the emolument clause, right? Not on most people's lips. The pardon power. But, I mean, I mentioned some of the things I think we ought to deal with. Electoral college, having voting rights, but, I don't think a whole rewrite of a lot of it is necessary. Now, we may run into a problem if the court does what I'm afraid it's going to do next year under the major questions doctrine, that they are going to so seriously limit the ability of administrative agencies to do anything that could lead to a need for some kind of constitutional clarification. At this mock convention that was held a few weeks ago, they passed a amendment that would also incredibly tighten the Commerce Clause so that there would be almost nothing that the federal government could act on. That could become a need to clarify as well at some point. Those are not minor things, but they are things you don't hear about as much.
Hi, Senator Feingold. Thank you for joining us. So my question is actually about your state. I'm sure you know the Republicans in your state are threatening to impeach a newly elected state Supreme Court justice who just won in a convincing landslide for a 50-50 state. That's probably the latest in a long line of anti-democratic behavior from the Wisconsin GOP. Just if you have any special thoughts on that, do you think it's just hot air they're blowing, or do you think they're actually seriously considering doing it, and do you think they'll be successful in doing it?
Really good question. And just let me pull back and talk about the big picture here. See, what they're trying to do on this and all these other questions is make the law of this country merely the legislative branches of the state legislatures. So when they go to the United States Supreme Court and say, we think there should be an independent state legislature theory, saying that the state legislature can disregard what the Supreme Court and the people of the state have said of who has won an election, it's because they want this crazy notion that it's just the legislature that matters. And so this obviously is related to what I was just discussing at the Constitutional Convention, and it relates to this insane Wisconsin situation. I was a state senator for 10 years. I thought I knew the Wisconsin Constitution pretty well. Nobody ever mentioned impeachment. I had no idea. I mean, maybe if somebody had asked me, this is it's after Nixon, but before the Clinton impeachment and all this. But nobody ever said, all right, we're going to impeach you. Sure enough, these people are so power hungry and you realize we have a Democratic governor who's been elected twice, a Democratic lieutenant governor, a Democratic attorney general, a Democratic state treasurer, a majority of Supreme Court justices are on the progressive side, and yet our legislature is 2/3 Republican in the state Senate and like 2/3 Republican in the state Assembly. How can you do that math? Only by cheating. So now what are they going to try to do? This woman won by 200,000 votes. I can only dream about having gotten that kind of a margin in one of my elections. It was about choice. It was about Dobbs. My state's, quote, pro-life, but not really. The people of my state don't want this Dobbs thing. So she wins in a very visible race, was right out there. And she's been sworn in, she hasn't even ruled on her first case. And they're going to try to impeach her. And here's the crazy thing. Yes, they have 2/3 of the vote in the state Senate, but it probably wouldn't hold. Somebody probably wouldn't do it. And the majority leader of the state Senate said he's not going to take it up. But they only need a majority vote in the state Assembly to impeach her. And they have a huge majority. I think a couple of them might be courageous. But here's the thing I didn't know. If they impeach her and then the Senate doesn't act, she's suspended. She can't act. The people of the state's fundamental decision would have been denied. I don't think they're just blowing smoke. I think, I have a little sympathy for some of these state assemblyman people. They're almost all right-wingers. Here's the deal. If any single one of them has the courage to say, I'm not voting for this, it's wrong, they will be removed by a Trump person in the next election. You know that's how it operates. I think in the end they might not do it, but, and you're more of a constitutional law professor than I am, for sure. I'm wondering under Article 4 of the U.S. Constitution, which is also not often discussed, the guarantee of a Republican form of government, if it can be said that Wisconsin has a Republican form of government, if they can do this. So one of my friends has filed a preliminary injunction lawsuit to try to prevent it. I mean, this is uncharted territory. But we're in a real, can you imagine if they actually start doing this? They could do it to all the justices. And then what does our side do? We just sit back and say, okay, you can have all the justices, We're in real danger on this stuff. And you've gone through similar terrible things here.
Question and follow-up to that, and I'm sure we have other questions out there, but in follow-up to that, that is disturbing, no doubt, and that Constitution needs to be amended. If she's suspended during impeachment and that's constitutional, that needs to be amended for sure. But if you look at what the people do from time to time, it gives me hope. So in Ohio, for example, they wanted to amend the Constitution. The GOP wanted to amend the Constitution and make it more difficult to amend. The people refused. And that was, I think it was a blatant strategic move on the part of the GOP in Ohio. But I took some solace from that the people can push back.
And Ohio's been very interesting lately. They have a bipartisan anti-death penalty bill. And one of the students I met today was talking about his interest in federalism. I don't know if he's here tonight. Yes. You made me think about this, is that the states, you're the one from Philadelphia, right? That the states really can lead on these things, and it can give other states courage. Of course, we saw this in Kansas with the repudiation of Dobbs there. So yes, it gives me heart too, and yes, a good federalism. When I grew up, one of our reputations was that we were a clean state and that we were sort of one of these great states that was one that experimented with things first. It was a laboratory of democracy. Wisconsin was the first state for child labor laws, the first state for unemployment compensation. Social Security was invented on Bascom Hill at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. The idea of a public service commission, of utility control. These things are often very well do start at the state level. So yeah, I do think some of this is happening. And what often happens is that federal legislators start getting a little nervous when their state starts doing things. I remember when Susan Collins came to the Senate, and it was just McCain-Feingold at the time. We had Fred Thompson for a while, the late senator from Tennessee, was an actor.
He was wonderful.
Red actor.
Yes.
Great guy, but he complained that it was McCain-Feingold-Thompson when we were losing, and we were winning, we dumped his name. So, John always really enjoyed that. But Susan shows up and wins on the same day that Maine passes public financing. She came over to see me in 5 minutes because she knew, as a senator from a state where the state had done that she should get on board, and she became a very valuable ally. So I think you're absolutely right. It is a basis of hope and a place where young people should work. Lawyers should really think about the exciting power of the states. And this state's one of the most important ones that people are watching like hawks to see what happens here.
Yeah, so would you go to the microphone? We need it just because it records for the video, so thanks.
Oh, I understand. Okay, so you talked about a lot of things I'm interested in, but I'll limit it to just one question. So you talked about Article 5 reform and possible ways that could look afterwards. So you talked about perhaps a double majority system like what Switzerland has. What would really be kind of your preference? What do you think is like a wise compromise that maybe the other side could actually agree to?
I'm concerned that we have to have a somewhat lower percentage than 2/3. I think just making that a little bit easier, maybe 60 votes in both houses, that's still a substantial number when you consider that it then has to go to 3/4 of the states. But then I would couple it with a popular plebiscite requirement, that has to be a popular vote at both the state level and national level to pass a constitutional amendment. I would do it something like that. But I'll be honest with you, I haven't done the deep dive on this part of it, that that I've come to the point where I'm sure I think there are many other good ideas about how to do it. But I think that might work.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions?
Thank you, Senator. In your own experience, you've reached across the aisle. You've worked with people on both ends of the political spectrum. Now, a lot of what you've talked about today is potentially partisan constitutional issues that could arise. What can individual legislators and individuals do to bridge the gap and start to work together, similar to your experience with McCain?
Well, you know, it kind of reminds me of a story about talking about McCain-Feingold. So one of the things I made a lot of crazy promises to get elected in an underdog race in 1992. And one promise I made, which people thought was insane, was that I would go to every one of Wisconsin's 72 counties every year and hold a town meeting. And I did. 1,200 town meetings. I actually loved it. I mean, some of the times it was irritating because of the travel, but, and you know, I'd go to the most right-wing counties. That was my favorite part. And people would come in and kind of look at me like, you know, this guy's a liberal, what's he doing here? So I went to a place called Wapaka County, which you should go to. They've got these 20 lakes that are all connected, and it's wonderful. So about 40 people are in the town hall, and my practice was to just go and say, hi, I'm Russ Feingold, and I'll just talk to you for a couple minutes, and then you get to ask me questions and stuff. But I'd always start off mentioning something. And I said, one time in Wapaka, I said, hey, I'm going to be doing a piece of legislation with John McCain of Arizona. Huge cheers. I said, well, what are you cheering? How do you know? It might be an anti-cheese bill, you know? But the point is that people relished the idea then of bipartisanship. When I was 29 years old and ran for the state senate against an 83-year-old guy who had been in for 50 years, I beat him by 31 votes out of 47,000. You know, the people would say to me, I'd knock on the door. I learned my lesson right away. I'd go to some little town, Partyville, Wisconsin. I'd knock on the door. I'd kind of look at you. What are you doing? I was 29. My hair was like this. I weighed 10 pounds, you know. And I'd say, hey, I'm Russ Feingold. I'm from Janesville, and I live in Middleton with my family. And I'd start saying something about Democrat. And we don't want to hear that. We want to know what you're going to, we don't care which party you're in, we want to know what you're going to do when you get in there. That was the premise of my career. It was also the end of my career. Because what happened in 2010 is people decided, and that's too bad on the liberal side too, that we're not doing that anymore. But what my answer is that what you should say to politicians is, all right, you want to be a state assemblyman, or you want to be a state senator, or you want to be a member of Congress. You get out there now. I'm going to vote for you. And in 2 years, if you can't come back and tell me what legislation you've done on a bipartisan basis and with who, and what the results are, I'm not voting for you again. That's what it has to be. Look, the members of the Senate and the House, although now I'm not so sure, but this whole thing with the nastiness didn't start with the members. They were pushed to do it by Fox News, by social media. Politicians care, unfortunately, basically about only one thing, their political survival. There are rare exceptions. The reason they acted like this is not because they're nasty or jerks or unfriendly. Everybody's pleasant to each other. It's not like that at all. It's because the people don't want them working together. This is what's changed. You know, throwing out Richard Lugar in Indiana in a primary, throwing out Bennett in Utah in a primary. This is what's happened. And so the people have to decide. The people have to send the message, you will only get to stay in office if you work with the other side. And you can convey that message. I would have loved it if people knew that I was doing that. And that, frankly, is why I survived longer than I probably should have. Because, you know, people thought, well, what happened in 2004, Bush wins the state. But I carried 27 counties that Bush carried, and that Kerry didn't. Why? Because I go in the conservative areas and they go, you know what I like about you? I never know what you're going to do. You know, not like I was crazy, but that I hadn't already decided in advance. Well, that's not valued anymore. But that was my trademark. And that's what we need to get back to.
It's a shame we can't ratify a constitutional amendment that would force people to act in a bipartisan fashion. That's the one thing that can't be done by amendment. That we should. Well, I think we need to bring the senator to dinner, but I want to thank everyone for being here. I do want to mention before we disperse that in May of 2024, here at ASU at the law school, we're hosting a constitutional convention of the states. Don't get nervous, Senator. It is going to be, it's going to be a simulation with law students and senior undergraduate students, with students from each state convening here. We certainly hope the American Constitution Society is involved, as well as the Federalist Society, because we want it to be as bipartisan and as sort of ideologically diverse as possible. And we've received a very substantial gift to ensure that all the students can come here free of charge, and we're going to support them at the convention. So for those of you who are interested in participating, Senator, we'd love to keep you informed about what's going to happen here. We think it's going to be a very exciting event. And we're working with the National Constitution Center to seed the convention with some proposed amendments. And then let's see what the students do. It's your generation next, right? So we hope that you might come up with some interesting ideas for amendments that could eventually catch hold, like that University of Texas student.
True confession that the reason I got involved in this topic was I was teaching at Stanford, and Professor McConnell, who is sort of related to McConnell, but he's a conservative. I participated in this sort of thing, and I thought, is this going to be like? But we all proposed amendments, and then others critiqued it, and we voted on them.
I'd like to hear more about that.
Yeah, you should probably contact.
And the only reason we use the Convention of the States model is because it's simplified.
Yeah.
We didn't have to simulate Congress and the states. It was just a little more simple. But we're looking forward to that event, and we'll certainly keep you posted about it.
Just don't call it the Convention of the States.
No, we're calling it the Model Constitutional Convention or something like that.
Thank you, or I'll have protesters outside.
Okay.
Thank you, Professor.
Yeah, and thank you so much, Senator Feingold. We're just so thrilled that you were here and to inform us about this important development, obviously. I want to say a couple things. First, I want to thank the Jack Miller Center for their support for this Constitution Day lecture. They have also provided us with some pocket constitutions. Recommend that all of you take one with you. They're always handy. You never know when you might need one. So they're out there. I want to thank Carol McNamara, who's the powerhouse behind the center's operations. Carol, thank you so much. Dean Leeds, thank you for your support for this program.